Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining this webinar. It's a true pleasure to do this for the Down Syndrome Indiana Association. And I'm going to talk a little bit about aging and Down syndrome. And just as a bit of background about myself, I'm here at the University of Kentucky in the Sanders Brown Center on Aging. And along with my colleague, Dr. Fred Schmidt, he and I have been running an aging study in people with Down syndrome. We're on our 8th year now, so we've been learning a lot from our families and our volunteers. And part of this presentation will be to give you a bit of background about what happens with brain aging in people with Down syndrome and what things we're learning about in our study. And I'll focus at least 15 or 20 minutes talking about what ways we think you might be able to prevent or slow the development of Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. Some of those suggestions are rather generic. They're pulled from the literature and studies in people who don't have Down syndrome, but I think in many ways they'll apply quite nicely. And for your own benefit too, everybody likes to learn more about ways to healthy aging. So let me give you a little bit of overview of what I'll be talking about. The first thing I'm going to do is tell you about what is Alzheimer's disease, to get us all on the same page so we have the same understanding of what this disease is all about. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the link between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease. And there's a strong genetic link between these two scenarios. I'm going to skip over pharmacological treatments of Alzheimer's disease in this webinar. We might consider having an MD and one of our neurologists talk about this in more detail. But I will talk about prevention in a lot of detail and hopefully leave you with a positive take-home message when you finish listening to this webinar. So Alzheimer's disease is the leading cause of dementia in our elderly. It's the sixth leading cause of death in all of the United States. It's quite an expensive disease to manage, both in terms of treatment of the patient with the disease, but also in terms of time lost by family members when they're taking care of that person. We expect that these numbers are going to exponentially increase in the coming years. And so, as you can imagine, we're very excited here in the academic setting that the NIH is putting more and more money into research to help us understand what are the causes of this disease and how can we prevent this. Alzheimer's disease was first described in 1901, so we've known about this disease for over 100 years. And it's kind of sad to say at this point still we really don't have a way to stop or prevent the disease, but we've gotten into some really promising intervention studies and some new leads that we think are going to be promising for the coming years. But the first description of this disease was in 1901 by describing a person. Her name was Augusta D. And she was seen by a neurologist in Germany named Dr. Alzheimer. She appeared with a cluster of clinical symptoms. She showed aphasia, which means a loss of language ability. She was very disoriented with respect to where she was and what time it was, what time of the year it was. She had some very unpredictable behaviors. She did also have hallucinations, which is not necessarily a common feature of Alzheimer's disease. But she was obviously very, very demented in terms of she was not able to take care of herself, and she had a lot of functional difficulties. So when Augusta D. came to autopsy, Dr. Alzheimer described some of her pathology, which I'll show you in mere moments. So how do we diagnose dementia in the clinic? And there's a number of ways clinicians can work through a series of neurologic tests and neuropsychological tests to determine if somebody has possible dementia, probable dementia, or definite dementia, which does not occur, unfortunately, until after someone has passed away. And there are a number of dementias. Dementia is just an umbrella term that says somebody is showing signs of functional decline to the point where it impairs with their day-to-day living abilities. But there can be different causes of that dementia. So the most common cause of dementia in the elderly is Alzheimer's disease. We can also have vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia. So what's changing in the brain to lead to that dementia can vary, but the most common is Alzheimer's disease. And what we've been learning along with not only in our research here, but across clinics in the United States and internationally, is it can be challenging to diagnose dementia in people with Down syndrome. And that is because we do have a background of intellectual disability. And what we have to understand is that person changing over time? So sometimes a single visit to a clinician might not be enough to say if somebody is showing the early signs of dementia. We have to watch as somebody progresses in that disease. So as I mentioned, the only way we can diagnose Alzheimer's definitively is at postmortem. And when we look at those brains of people who have dementia when they were alive, and we look at their brains after they passed away, we look for specific kinds of pathology to say whether or not that person had Alzheimer's disease. And as one example, you can see that in healthy brain aging, we see a nice thick cortex, lots of white matter, and a healthy hippocampus, which is a little part of the brain that's really involved with memory, in a normal aging person. And then in a person who's died with advanced Alzheimer's disease might show loss of tissue. You can see very clearly the thinning of the cortex. There's bigger gaps. The ventricles are larger, and that little hippocampal region is so shrunken it's almost completely gone. So this can be a sign of Alzheimer's disease when someone's passed away. But what we really need to see microscopically are two hallmark pathologies, and that for us definitively says when they have enough of this pathology, this person has died with Alzheimer's disease. And the first thing that we look for are these beta amyloid plaques. These plaques, and they're shown here in these kind of green deposits, these are made up of a protein that's all clumped together, and it's in between the cells of the brain, and it actually kind of pushes the cells apart. The protein in that plaque is really toxic to our neurons. Our neurons don't like being around it. They get very sick, and they may die if they have this around them. So we need to see lots of these plaques in the brain of a person who's passed away with dementia. Second, we need to see neurofibrillary tangles, and these tangles are fill up the neuron. You can see these little strands filling up a neuron, and that neuron can't function well with all that pathology inside of it. So the connections between your neurons, which lead to your ability to learn and remember, get disconnected over time, and that's what causes the learning and memory problems that we identify with Alzheimer's disease. So the important protein that's involved with plaques is called beta amyloid, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more because it's critically important for Down syndrome. The protein involved in tangles is called tau protein, and so we have two proteins really that kind of go wrong in the brain of a person who's developed Alzheimer's disease. So what is the link between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease? As you all know, Down syndrome was first described in 1887 by J. Langdon Down, but it wasn't until about 1959 that Dr. Lejeune and Dr. Gautier identified the cause of Down syndrome. The primary cause, of course, is an extra copy of chromosome 21, which happily enough happens to be the smallest chromosome that we have in our genome, and it encodes for about 800 genes, which isn't an overwhelming number, all things told, but it's sufficiently small where babies can be born with that abnormality and go on to live pretty good quality life. So the most common cause of Down syndrome is a full extra copy of chromosome 21, and that'll count for about 95% of people with Down syndrome. But there's two other kinds or causes of Down syndrome. One is translocation, and this is where only a piece of that little chromosome 21 gets stuck to another chromosome and is triplicated. So that means not all the genes are present in triplicate, but only a small number of genes are. We can learn an awful lot from these people, and maybe that would be a topic for another webinar about what we can learn from these people. And we also have a scenario called mosaicism, and that is where not all the cells in the body have that full extra copy of chromosome 21. Only a subset of cells have this. And we determine that from the blood test, and we can see how many cells in the blood have an extra copy of chromosome 21, and we can ask what percentage of cells have an extra copy. So in the case of full trisomy 21, 100% of the cells will have it, but in the case of mosaicism, we might have only 10% of the cells, or 40% of the cells have an extra copy of chromosome 21. So as you can imagine, when people have translocation or mosaicism, the way that they look and their intellectual disability might be lesser or more, relatively speaking, to full trisomy 21. So how does the extra copy of chromosome 21 in Down syndrome lead to a higher risk for Alzheimer's disease as people with Down syndrome get older? And this is primarily due, we think, to one gene, but we're learning more and more now that a number of genes are playing together to enhance risk for Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. So the first gene, and the gene I'm going to focus on primarily for this talk, is on chromosome 21. There's a gene for the amyloid precursor protein, which I've abbreviated as APP, and that's what I will call it from now on. And so this protein is present in higher amounts than what we see in people without Down syndrome. So from birth, people with Down syndrome are already making too much of this amyloid precursor protein gene. Now this amyloid precursor protein gene is really important for Alzheimer's disease. And this protein is very long. It's about 600 to 700 amino acids long, and it kind of sticks out of the cell or inside of the cell and organelles. And it gets cut. Little scissors come in and cut this protein into a very short piece, which we call beta amyloid. And that's that yellow little piece here. And it's a small little peptide. It's only about 40 or 42 amino acids long. But what happens is, in people with Down syndrome, is we have more of this amyloid precursor protein. So we see more of this beta amyloid protein, the little piece being cut out. And all those little pieces of beta amyloid protein collect up together to form what we see in the brain as plaques. And that was the picture that I showed you previously. Imagine all this protein sticking together in a clump and accumulating over time in a person's brain. Now, the really cool thing is recently, new techniques have been developed where we can see these plaques when somebody is still alive. We don't have to wait until they pass away. The resolution isn't terrific because of the procedure that we use, and we use positron emission tomography, or PET scans, to see this. And what we can do is intravenously inject a compound that will go into your blood and up into your brain, and then it will stick to these plaques in your brain, and the PET scanner can see where there is binding. So in an example of a person who's 44 years of age with Down syndrome, the red spots tell you where we're seeing plaques in the brain of that person while they're still alive. Whereas a person who's younger, 38 years of age, can show far less plaque binding. I apologize for the sirens. When we ask people with Down syndrome to volunteer for these studies with a range of ages, and they are able to do these PET scans with us, what we can see is that depending on the age of that person with Down syndrome, we see a progressively increasing number of plaques binding in the brains of these individuals. So when we look at a person who's in their 40s, they might have some plaques in their brains. But when a person with Down syndrome is in their 50s, we see far more of these plaques. So that means simply with age in people with Down syndrome, we can estimate pretty nicely how many plaques or how much plaque pathology they might have as they get older. And these studies are going to be important because in future, when we have treatments that could get rid of this plaque pathology, we could use PET scans to see if we're clearing this pathology from the brain. So that's going to be very important for future studies. So that brings us to the next question. What is the age of onset of Alzheimer's disease, neuropathology, and Down syndrome? And I'm going to really clearly distinguish between what we see when I talk about neuropathology is what we see in the brains of people with Down syndrome. And then I'm going to distinguish that from talking about when do we see dementia in people with Down syndrome, because they're not always happening at exactly the same time, which is a really good thing. And when I come to that, I'll tell you why. What we do know from many, many years of studies, both from people around the world and from our own laboratory, that by the time a person with Down syndrome has reached 40 years of age, almost all of them have full-blown Alzheimer's disease neuropathology in their brains. So that means they have both plaques and the tangles in sufficient numbers to say that that person had Alzheimer's disease. And notice here what's interesting is what I've plotted here is how many people have both plaques and tangles. So what percentage of people that were studied had plaques and tangles, And this is different age ranges. And what you can see between 30 and 40 years, there is a dramatic increase in Alzheimer's disease pathology in the brains of people with Down syndrome. So the bad news is there is this rapid accumulation. The good news is we know when this is happening. And that means in future, if we wanted to design prevention studies, we have a really good shot of doing this for people with Down syndrome because we know the age at which to target some of our interventions. So I know this sounds like bad news, that virtually everybody, if they have full trisomy 21, have full-blown Alzheimer's disease in their brain, but there's like this really interesting disconnect, and we're seeing this more and more frequently now, because there is actually some good news. And that is, just because a person has full-blown Alzheimer's disease in their brain doesn't necessarily mean they have dementia. So this graph shows what % of people with Down syndrome have signs of dementia. And each of these lines are data from 3 different studies from around the world. And here's the age of people that were evaluated to see if they had signs of dementia. And this is all in people with Down syndrome. And what you can see is, although we're seeing the Alzheimer's pathology in their 40s, it takes almost 10 years before we start to see signs of dementia. So there's a kind of a sweet spot there that, again, if we can find the right intervention, we could target right in that spot to catch people before they show signs of decline. But the other really good news about this graph, and more data are coming out with similar numbers, if not even greater numbers, is even in their 60s, 2 studies are showing it's not 100% of people with Down syndrome who are showing dementia. We still have 20% of people who have full-blown Alzheimer's disease in their brains who are getting into their 60s and not showing signs of decline. And to us, that is really very exciting, because if we can understand what is special about this 20% of people, then maybe we can take that to everybody, including those people with Down syndrome as our priority, but also to everybody in the general population. So there's some really good news in all of this, I think. We need to be cautious about interpreting, for an individual person, can we say that person is definitely going to develop disease or dementia or not? But all I know is there's still 20% of people at this point that don't. So that's the good news. So it's one of the happy take-home messages. So here at the University of Kentucky, we've been working with a group of volunteers with Down syndrome who range in age from 25 years and older, and they can be showing signs of dementia or not. And we've asked them to come visit us every year, and we follow them just to see what happens as they get older and older and older, and see if there are signs of early dementia that we can pick up on. We need to understand maybe there's some proteins in the blood that we can measure that can tell us who's going to develop dementia, or more importantly, when they might develop dementia. Because we don't really understand this perfectly well yet. Even in all the studies around the world, we're all working very hard just to understand what happens normally with aging and people with Down syndrome. Because once we get a handle of that, then we're going to be in really good shape to do some promising clinical trials where we try to slow this process down. But the first step is understanding the process. And so the goals of our study are what are the earliest signs of dementia? And we do this by looking at changes in neurological function. We do this looking at changes in memory and learning. Can we do a more accurate diagnosis of dementia in people with Down syndrome? And if we can catch these early signs very early, maybe that means in future that would be a target for when we could intervene, be it with a drug or with some kind of behavioral modification or lifestyle modification. We could maybe slow this process down. It's really important for us to also understand not only when do we want to target a treatment or prevention study, but what do we want to target? Because we might need to target different things at different ages in people with Down syndrome. And the better we understand that, the more promising our studies will be in the future. And we also need to understand what do we need to measure over time in a person with Down syndrome so that we can know if a treatment is going to be beneficial or not beneficial. And surprisingly enough, in all the clinics, everybody does slightly different things, and we're all trying to work together to find out what are the best measures, what toolkit can we put together for everybody to use so we're all on the same page. So as I mentioned, our study is recruiting people who are 25 years and older. So we're trying to keep our group around 80 people in total, and we're pretty close to that. We're at 76 people right now. Every year people come in and visit with us, and here's some pictures of one of our lovely volunteers visiting with Roberta Davis, who's our coordinator. And our volunteers come in, and the first thing they do is provide us with a blood sample. Sometimes that's a little scary for folks, and sometimes we can't do that for some people, but we try as best as we can. We don't take any more blood than what would be given normally for a doctor's visit. We give a blood sample. They see a neurologist, and we have 3 fantastic neurologists here that do an assessment and talk to the family about changes. Then there's a neuropsychological assessment. So for about an hour and a half, different learning and memory tasks, which are kind of fun to do. And then after lunch, we take a break. We go in and do brain pictures with MR imaging. And so that, as you all may know, is a non-invasive procedure where somebody lies down and goes into a machine and pictures of the brain are taken. So we've been working on this we're up to year 8, and we have 2 more years funded, and we're hoping to renew this for another 5 years. So we've had some wonderful volunteers in our program for 8 years now, and we can't thank them enough for that. Some of our families have been super kind and have consented to autopsy. The reason for that is for us to figure out what drugs or what interventions might be most beneficial for people with Down syndrome. We need to see all the different kinds of molecules and proteins that change in the brain as somebody gets older to see what is changing in a direction we don't want it to be and maybe target that. So autopsy studies for us are very important, but if families are not comfortable with that, that's also totally fine. And as I mentioned, right now we're about 74 people. We have 2 more people that are coming since I made this table. And we have a group of people who are not demented, around average age of 40 years. And we have a group of people who are already showing signs of dementia that are typically older, not surprising, around 57 years of age. And up to now, we've had 5 people donate their brains for research purposes, for which we're very thankful. So this is a very active study, and we're always looking for more volunteers to join our team. So let me talk a little bit about something we thought would be interesting for families to think about. And that is, I've given you a lot of statistics about when we see dementia start to happen in people with Down syndrome, what's going on in the brains of people with Down syndrome. So what can we do to maybe right now, even though we don't have any definitive studies, what are some of the things that we could do now that might promote healthy brain aging, both in our family members with Down syndrome and also for ourselves? And a lot of this applies to both. And one of the most important things that we're learning, and there are more and more papers coming out about this in the general population, is it's absolutely critical to control co-occurring illnesses. And a lot of the co-occurring illnesses that any of us have, and that might be present in higher frequencies in people with Down syndrome, have been linked to risk of Alzheimer's disease and linked to earlier onset Alzheimer's disease. So, for example, it's really important that we stay on top of hypothyroidism in family members and friends with Down syndrome. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that hypothyroidism can enhance risk for Alzheimer's disease in the general population. And of course, we see this far more frequently in people with Down syndrome. So making sure to keep on top of hypothyroidism is a really important thing to do. We've been finding a lot more frequently in people with Down syndrome vitamin deficiencies that can lead to cognitive impairments and enhance your risk for Alzheimer's disease. Again, this also applies to the general population. So one of the blood tests that we do in our general Alzheimer's clinic is just check for B vitamin levels, because that can lead to a lot of cognitive impairments. And what we're seeing in people with Down syndrome is vitamin D levels are tending towards the lower side. And we have more and more people who are actually vitamin D deficient. So getting tested for that and treating that is going to be super important for everybody. And it's surprising, we're getting a lot of families talking about this and clinicians talking about how frequent this is in Down syndrome. And as you know, vitamin D is something you typically get from being outdoors and in the sunlight. So that might suggest there might be some other lifestyle factors going on here in people with Down syndrome about getting out and exercising and getting exposed to light. Diabetes can occur in people with Down syndrome and also in the general population. We know diabetes is a definite risk factor for the development of Alzheimer's disease, particularly if it's not well controlled. Epilepsy, now that's an interesting one. Epilepsy can lead to higher risk for Alzheimer's disease in the general population, and there are a number of people with Down syndrome who have epilepsy from when they were children or younger. What we are seeing, however, is that as a person with Down syndrome gets older, there might be new onset seizures, and we think that's part of the Alzheimer's disease dementia syndrome here. And that is something, of course, as soon as that happens, right away, get that managed, because you don't want to have seizures over and over. That will drive a lot of Alzheimer's pathology. Another co-occurring illness that's very frequent in people with Down syndrome is sleep apnea. And it can be challenging to diagnose when in babies and in children, but there are ways to do this. But certainly in older adults, we can see this occurring frequently. And sleep apnea leads to small times where there's no oxygen getting to the brain, or it's depleted, and that can lead to brain tissue loss, and also that leaves you at risk for Alzheimer's disease. So for everybody who has sleep apnea, trying to control that and manage that is critically important for how your brain is going to age. There's some evidence in the general population that psychiatric conditions like depression or anxiety, chronic, can lead also to enhanced risk for Alzheimer's disease. So those are things, again, stay on top of that, manage that. And cardiovascular disease is a big risk factor in the general population. And this is where people with Down syndrome have the advantage. And that is, it's very rare to see hypertension or high blood pressure in people with Down syndrome. It's very rare to see atherosclerosis. So in many ways, people with Down syndrome might be a little bit protected from this, which is some good news. So we can modify lifestyle factors to benefit the brain. So I talked about these co-occurring illnesses, and you immediately jump to thinking about drugs. Fair one. There are many of these conditions that can only be managed through drugs. But there's a lot of these factors we can manage just through modifying our lifestyles. For example, type 2 diabetes, which leads you to risk for Alzheimer's disease, is closely linked to obesity. So managing weight through lifestyle factors, it could be really important for a healthy brain. Poor cardiovascular function, which again may not necessarily apply 100% of the time for people with Down syndrome, but the better your heart's working, the better oxygenation of your brain occurs, the better the blood is in getting up to your brain. So making sure that, again, managing weight and getting exercise are really important. It's also really critically important to get good sleep. And again, I know these things sound pretty obvious, but it's remarkable when you do look at different studies and you talk to families and you do your examinations of people, you see that these factors are all in play here. People are not managing their weight. They are not getting good sleep. So again, it's really important to consider ways to work or control obstructive sleep apnea, and particularly in people with Down syndrome. And I know that's challenging. I know that's not an easy thing. But there are ways to work with doctors to try to get that condition dealt with. And as we go along from our own study and from other studies, and we talk frequently, all of the investigators, we're finding other factors that we think might be modifiable through lifestyle changes. So again, it's incredibly important to consider lifestyle factors. They are very potent in terms of modifying your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So a big question I get asked by families is, in thinking about lifestyle factors, is what about diet? What is a healthy diet to promote healthy brain aging? And there's lots of evidence now, the different diets, and I'm not talking some of the fad diets, but a good healthy diet, rich in fruits and vegetables, can have wonderful benefits to the brain and can promote healthy brain aging. And I'm presenting one of these diets. It's most people know about this diet, the Mediterranean diet. And the reason I'm talking about this one is not because I think it's absolutely the hands down best one in the entire world, but because there's so much data about this diet. And it turns out people who kind of follow along the lines of this Mediterranean diet tend to be at lower risk for Alzheimer's disease. And that could be because of lots of antioxidants from fruits and vegetables. It could be lots of healthy fats from fish and oils, But all we know for sure is that when you do have a healthy diet, and we're not talking our standard North American fast food diet, then you can do a lot of good for your brain and prevent and slow down potentially a lot of these pathologies we associate with Alzheimer's disease. Antioxidants, I get asked a lot about this. People ask, should my son or daughter be taking an antioxidant supplement? There's lots of supplements that are advertised online that these pills contain all these antioxidants, and if you take that, you can prevent Alzheimer's disease. And frankly, there's not a lot of data to support this, and a lot of the data that are out there in controlled clinical trials where we give people antioxidants and we see if it helps with symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, the data typically show up to be negative. So what it's telling us probably is taking your antioxidants in a pill is not nearly as good as getting it from your food. And your antioxidants work best when they're together as a group. So vitamin C helps to recycle vitamin E, for example. So trying to get a really good diet down with lots of antioxidants, fruits and vegetables will be far more beneficial to your brain than trying to take an extra vitamin E pill, which on its own, if it's too high a dose, could be toxic. Exercise. This is a really, really big deal. There are data from 20, 30 years now working with animal models of aging, looking at people who start exercise programs or people who naturally or have selected to exercise over their lifespans. Exercise is hugely protective against Alzheimer's disease. And we think that's for a couple of reasons. One is that, by exercising, you're reducing, again, some of these other risk factors that can drive Alzheimer's disease. So reducing obesity and your risk of diabetes, getting your heart working well, getting lots of blood and oxygenation to your brain, all these are really good benefits of exercise. And it turns out that when you exercise, your brain starts to grow new neurons and form new connections. So if you can imagine, you might be losing neurons as you get older or developing Alzheimer's disease. Exercise might help those neurons stay healthy and maybe even grow some new ones. And our neurons will secrete growth factors to other neurons around them and make them healthier too. So there's a direct link between exercise and what happens in the molecules in your brain. And all of those are beneficial. We don't know yet, though. And here's the tricky thing is how much exercise do you need to have? And what kind of exercise? Is aerobic okay? Do you need strength training, resistance training? A lot of those questions haven't been answered yet. And I think the general rule of thumb when I talk to colleagues is essentially if you're following the American Health Association exercise guidelines, that you are probably doing more than enough for what your brain would like in terms of staying healthy. And the nice thing about exercise, of course, is very social. It can be a very, very social activity. And that on its own has additional benefits. You've all heard about brain training and reducing your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And there's clinical trials going on right now using, quote, brain training in patients with Alzheimer's disease in the general population. And we're waiting to see what these benefits might be. But your brain is like a muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it. And the more active you are in learning new things, in practicing things, the stronger your neurons become and the stronger their connections become. And again, it's another way to actually get your brain to grow a few more new neurons. So, and if you have lots of neurons, and for example, people who have lots of years of education tend to be protected from Alzheimer's disease, we think that's because people who have lots of education or have lots of skills keep growing new neurons and connections, and to the point where if they do develop Alzheimer's disease, they have a lot more buffering capacity. They can lose more neurons before they start to show changes in function. So all that to say is pick up a new hobby or practice one that you love. And it could be doing arts and crafts. It could be learning a new instrument. It could be learning how to cook a healthy diet. All those things are beneficial for your brain. And certainly for a person with Down syndrome, these are really fun activities to engage in that's going to be good for them physically as well as intellectually. And social activities are also critical for brain health. People who have very active social lives have lots of friends. The larger network of friends people have is actually correlated with protection against Alzheimer's disease. And we think that might be because that the more social activity you engage in, again, your brain loves this, and it'll form nice, strong connections between neurons. It might grow some new neurons. It might keep the neurons that you have nice and healthy. So social activities are critically important for healthy aging. And one of the early signs we see in people with Down syndrome who are transitioning into dementia is withdrawal from social activities. I think, again, indicating we really need to keep pushing on being social, be that through activities you do as a group, be that through family activities, be that through church, whatever it takes to keep busy and active and making new friends. So there's lots of trials going on, not lots, there are some trials going on that we're trying to find ways to slow or prevent Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. And right now there's about 2 or 3 studies that are specifically for people with Down syndrome that different groups are testing different interventions, and one of them is a vaccine against beta amyloid. So we're excited to see how that works out. But one of the things we have to be really careful of when you're considering enrolling in clinical trials, enrolling your son or daughter or brother or sister, is that some of the drugs that they might be looking at might not have been tried yet in people with Down syndrome. And because of the genetics of people with Down syndrome, we have to be super careful about different side effects. So if you're interested in engaging in clinical research, and we strongly support and encourage that, it's really fair to ask the person who's running that study all the tough questions before you enroll. But we need to do these studies to know for sure if the treatments we're thinking about using are going to be good for that person with Down syndrome and won't have any side effects that are going to be really challenging to deal with. So I put a little cartoon up here because one of the clinical trials that was ongoing in the general population was a compound that we get from wine. And red wine, as many people know, study after study has shown that moderate red wine consumption can lead to protection from Alzheimer's disease. And of course, we don't want everybody drinking wine all the time, so we're trying to figure out what the active compound is for that. So if you're interested in clinical trials, and I did a search of this yesterday, there are 28 studies ongoing for people with Down syndrome running across the lifespan. So those could be studies in children trying to improve language, it could be in young adults trying to improve motor function, but there really only are 4 right now dedicated to aging and Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. And one of those is just observational, in other words, like what we're doing here, just following people over time. But we do have a vaccine study going on. It's originating from the University of California at San Diego. There's a study looking at memantine, which is a drug prescribed for Alzheimer's disease in younger adults to see if this improves cognition. And similarly with a nicotine, not by smoking, but usually by patch, to see if that will also improve cognition in adults with Down syndrome. But the bad news, and this is where advocacy is really, really important, is almost all Alzheimer's disease clinical trials, Alzheimer's disease trials for people in the general population that are running and active, exclude people with Down syndrome specifically. And that's a good and a bad thing. It's a good thing because maybe we don't know if it's going to be safe for people with Down syndrome because of the different genetics, but it's bad because we're not giving the same opportunities to families of people with Down syndrome to engage in research and to help find potentially a way to stop or slow Alzheimer's disease. So I think in future we'll see more and more trials that are dedicated to people with Down syndrome. That's what I would love to see happen in the future, and I think that's what's going to happen. So let me kind of pull this all together for you. So in the beginning of the talk, I showed you why people with Down syndrome are at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease at an earlier age than everybody else without Down syndrome. But the good news to that is not everybody with Down syndrome shows signs of dementia, even up until their 60s. So the blanket statement that everybody with Down syndrome gets Alzheimer's disease is not entirely accurate. It might be true for what happens in the brain, but functionally we might see up to 20% of people still doing just fine in their 60s. The prevention approaches, I think, are going to be critical moving forward. And the more we learn about what lifestyle habits people have with Down syndrome and how that might help us understand who develops dementia, and maybe if they develop it earlier or later, is going to be important. And that's why these longitudinal studies are so critical. And stay hopeful, because there's lots of new treatments in the pipeline that we're testing for safety. And when they mature enough, of course, then a real clinical trial will happen and people will be asked to participate. So I'm hoping when that time comes, you might consider such a thing. Take-home messages is keep a healthy diet, eat lots of fruits and veggies, exercise, make that a regular part of your life. And for that person and family member with Down syndrome, dancing counts as exercise, and we all love to dance. Make lots of friends, engage in group activities, go visiting, play games, learn new things, maybe learn how to cook healthy vegetables and fruits, learn how to play a new instrument, make sure you're getting lots and lots of sleep. And in combination, all of these little lifestyle changes, and they add up over time, don't do all this at once if you don't want to, can help a person with Down syndrome feel better, be more engaged, and potentially reduce their risk or slow the age of onset of Alzheimer's disease. We all know that prevention is far more powerful than treating the disease. We've seen that in cancer, we've seen that with heart disease. This is definitely the way we want to go. So be active and proactive, and please make sure as families and as self-advocates to keep pushing doctors and researchers and the government to fund more studies so we can find really good ways to slow down Alzheimer's in people with Down syndrome. Volunteer if you can. We'd love to have more people in our study, and there's lots of studies around that are recruiting people to their teams. Please consider volunteering. We really do appreciate it. It not only helps other people with Down syndrome, but it can help everybody in the long run. And very importantly is to be positive. Always stay positive. Having a negative attitude or expectations about, I'm going to develop this disease at this age, doesn't do your brain any good. And so always stay positive. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. And of course, since we're in Lexington, I have to do a picture of a horse. And I hope you found this webinar informative. Would love to hear some feedback from you. And if there's questions at some point in the future that we can line up, we could maybe try this again, and I can address specific questions as that evolves. Thank you kindly.